This happened to me about 10 years ago when I was a senior in high school. I was staying up all night studying for an exam that I had the following day. I had my workstation set up in the dining room, and all of my school papers were scattered across the table. My parents were asleep upstairs in their bed, and the house was eerily quiet, except for the steady ticking of a clock. It was around 3 a.m. when I first heard the footsteps. To paint you an accurate picture, the dining room table was positioned directly next to a sliding glass door which led to the back porch, and the only thing keeping me from seeing the porch was a large curtain draped in front of the glass. The ceiling lights were off, and I had nothing but a small dim lamp which illuminated my studying materials. It was really all I needed, besides a few unhealthy snacks and some coffee to keep me going. I was just about to get ready to go to bed when suddenly I heard what sounded like loud, heavy footsteps approaching me slowly from the back porch. At first, I thought I was just hearing things, but after another deep thud landed, followed by the sound of creaking wood, reality set in. I was positive that there was a man walking on our porch, attempting to stay quiet. As the footsteps grew closer, my dog started to growl, apparently knowing that something was wrong. I tried to move, but I was completely frozen. It felt like I was glued to my seat in utter horror. Nothing like this had ever happened before, and I didn't know what to do. The footsteps were now right at the door, literally 2 feet away from me, and all that was separating me from this man was a thin pink curtain. Just then, I somehow found the will to move my muscles again. I started yelling, "Someone's on the back porch!" while running up the stairs to my parents' bedroom. My dad was up in a heartbeat with his shotgun in hand, wearing nothing but tighty-whities and a look of determination. I've never seen someone get up that fast in my life. No one was breaking into his house tonight, he must have thought. My mother trailed behind him quietly, asking what was happening. Her voice trembled with fear. By the time we came back down the stairs into the dining room, the man had taken off. My dad and I searched the backyard, but found nothing. Then we searched the exterior of the house, looking for signs of forced entry, but also found nothing. So we all decided to go to bed. My parents said that they believed my story about the man on the porch, but I could tell they were a little skeptical. It wasn't until a year later, when we actually had a security camera installed, that I was finally vindicated. One of our neighbors said that he saw someone hopping our fence in the middle of the night. We checked the tape, and sure enough, someone had hopped over the gate on the side of our house, walked up the porch steps, and attempted to break in through the sliding glass door, which was exactly what had happened on that one night a year prior. After a few more events like this, my parents finally decided to move further out into the country, and to this day, this story gives me chills whenever I think about it. What if I hadn't been awake studying that night and heard the man on the porch? I don't even want to think about what could have happened. A word of advice: lock your doors. The following events took place while my wife Emily and I were on our honeymoon this past June. We live in Washington State and are lucky to be surrounded by beautiful trees, rivers, and foothills, so we decided that we wanted to stay in a cabin rather than going somewhere more tropical for our honeymoon. The cabin we chose happened to be just outside of Leavenworth, about a few hours from where we live now. The drive was long, but it felt good to get away for a while, especially with this whole quarantine thing going on. We arrived at our log cabin Friday afternoon. Ours was the last cabin on the right, at the end of a dead-end street. When we first arrived, we noticed a young woman, maybe in her mid-20s, parked in front of the cabin next to ours, removing a pink suitcase from her car. We assumed she would be vacationing in the cabin next to us. We gave her a friendly wave, which she returned, and then we proceeded to park our car. The cabin was large and constructed from huge dark logs. Across from the main entrance, which was covered by an awning, stood a tall concrete retaining wall which was meant to prevent mudslides from flowing in from the ominous mountain above. Stacked against the retaining wall was a massive pile of firewood as well as a stump, within which a red axe was embedded. Our plan was to stay at the cabin for 2 nights and just relax. We packed a cooler full of beer and junk food, as well as some leftover snacks from our wedding. I know, classy, right? But after stressing about the logistics of having a wedding in the middle of a pandemic, we were just ready to let it all hang loose. I lugged the cooler to the front door, my wife trailing behind me with a camera tripod in one hand and her suitcase in the other. We brought the tripod along to take selfies. We wanted to be able to look back fondly on the experience through photographs for years to come. Little did we realize at the time that we would actually be remembering this experience for all the wrong reasons. We approached the front door, which was armed with a black keypad and required a code for entry. Our code was sent to us in an email by the rental company. Emily punched in the combination, opened the door, and stepped inside. We were immediately overwhelmed with the pure size of the thing. A massive living room with leather chairs and sofas greeted us upon our entry, along with a state-of-the-art kitchen to our right and staircases leading to both the upper and lower floors to our left. At the other end of the room was a cozy reading area with massive glass windows overlooking the misty green foothills. Attached to the dining room was an indoor-outdoor hot tub area separated by French doors. We craned our necks upwards to admire the gorgeous vaulted ceilings and the decorative wall art which encircled the large room. Animal heads and crude outdoor-themed jokes were plastered everywhere. Above the restroom to our immediate right, for example, hung a sign that read, "Oh crap," which made us both laugh. A little weird for a honeymoon, we thought, but the place had its charms. The cabin itself was way more than what we really needed. Overall, there were 3 stories, including a basement, the main floor, and the second floor. The cabin was equipped with 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a hot tub overlooking the mountains, and a sprawling deck with a panoramic view of the evergreens. And we had it all to ourselves. We started unpacking our clothes in the bedroom on the main floor, choosing that one because it had the most comfortable bed. Yes, we tested them all. After unpacking our things, we took a few photos of ourselves using the tripod. One in front of the stone fireplace in the living room, a few in the reading area, one looking down on us from the upper balcony, and a few out on the deck. We couldn't have been happier with our little getaway. But looking back now, I almost wish we would have never made the trip. After stuffing ourselves with hot dogs, beer, and other junk food, we got a little tipsy and rummaged around one of the closets, looking for a board game. We settled on a Would You Rather card game and sat down at the dining table to play. The orange sun was slowly setting, casting a warm light through the blinds and onto our playing cards. We were thoroughly enjoying our alone time together when we suddenly realized that we hadn't planned out what we should do the next day. We decided we should go to town and maybe do some window shopping or whatever we were allowed to do during quarantine. After all, as fun as the cabin was, we had already enjoyed nearly all of its amenities, including the hot tub. So we cleaned up our mess and got ready for bed. By this point, we were so drunk that we completely forgot to check any of the doors or windows to make sure that they were locked. Maybe if we had done so, the events that occurred the following day wouldn't have even happened. Early the next morning, I got up to read a book and enjoyed the quiet stillness of the cabin, something my wife and I weren't normally able to experience back at home. Everything was perfect. From the cozy leather armchair and sprawling view of the mountains, to the cup of hot coffee warming up my cold hands. But still, something didn't feel quite right. It was something that I had been attempting to shake off all morning, but that had finally made its way into the front of my mind, now distracting me from reading my book. I tried to hone in on what it was that was bothering me. I didn't think it was fear or anything like that, but I did feel unsettled. Too much coffee, I thought. A hangover, maybe. I wasn't sure, but the eventual "good morning" from my now awake wife snapped me out of it as she shuffled over to me with cute messy hair and a warm smile. I greeted her with a kiss, paused, and almost considered telling her about what was on my mind before quickly reconsidering. The last thing I wanted to do on our honeymoon was to scare her. So instead, I threw on some Jack Johnson and cooked breakfast for the two of us. Eggs and bacon, a much-needed change of pace from the junk we had consumed the night before. As we went over the details of our day ahead, my anxiety slowly retreated, and I all but forgot about the strange feeling. As we pulled out of the driveway around noon, we noticed that the car of the girl who was staying in the cabin next to us was gone. Strange, I thought. Did she already leave? Is she heading into town as well? I pondered it for a moment, but eventually shrugged it off as we made our way down the steep, winding road. We drove for about 20 minutes, passing by a few corner stores and rundown restaurants, when suddenly it started pouring down rain. Initially, Emily and I didn't mind, since we're both born and raised Seattleites with an affinity for wet weather. But as the dark clouds above us grew, so too did my creeping sense of dread. We were now turning around a sharp bend which overlooked a deep canyon. The fog was dense, and we could hardly see the cars ahead of us. Then, we were forced to roll to an abrupt halt when the cars in front of us stopped moving. I leaned my head out the window to see what was going on, and there were at least a dozen stalled cars, as well as a roadwork crew a couple miles ahead. I let out a deep, aggravated sigh. This was the only road into town, and it was completely blocked by what was probably a nasty accident up ahead. We were completely stuck. We waited a while for the accident to clear up, but it never did. Eventually, we decided that it was taking too long and that we should head back to the cabin, especially since both of us had to use the restroom. So I pulled a U-ey and sped off in the opposite direction. As we pulled up to our little romantic getaway for the second time, we noticed a man standing alone in the driveway of the neighboring cabin. He stood next to an unmarked white van. His gaze followed ours as we pulled our car into the parking space next to the garage. We stepped out of the car and he immediately started talking to us. "Are you guys staying in this cabin?" he asked. "Yes," I responded. "Why?" He stepped a little closer to our car. That's when I noticed that he was well built and covered head to toe in tattoos. He looked to be about 6 feet tall and was wearing a gray sweatsuit which fit him loosely. As he approached us, he fiddled with some black metallic object in his hands while he continued to speak. "Just wanted to make sure I wasn't parking in your space. I'm doing maintenance on this cabin over here." He pointed to the cabin behind him. "Wasn't sure which cabin you two were staying in. Thought I'd ask." I shook my head. "Nope, we're in this one. You're good, man." He nodded and walked away. My wife and I shared a momentary look of discomfort. Something felt off about this guy, and now he knew where we were staying. We made our way to the front door hastily, now desperately eager to use the restroom. But when we tried to enter in the code, there was a problem. The code we had used before was no longer working. Perplexed, we tried again, and again, and again, to no avail. The little red light just kept blinking at us, indicating that our code was incorrect. My wife pulled out her phone and searched through her messages. She found the code and double-checked the numbers. Yep, we were definitely using the right combo. At this point, we both started to panic a little. All of our things were locked inside the cabin, and we still had one more night left on our reservation. Emily browsed the rental company's website and came across the FAQ section. One of the questions happened to describe our exact predicament. Luckily, a phone number was also listed that we could call in case our code wasn't working. She dialed the number, and we waited. After about 10 minutes of waiting, I decided that I'd had enough. I told Emily to stay on the line and wait by the front door while I checked around the house for a way to get in. My bladder was about ready to explode. I made my way around the side of the cabin and trudged down a steep hill leading toward the back of the house. At this point, it's important to mention that the cabin was built on a steep slope. In other words, the basement was another viable entrance into the cabin if you had a key. I clumsily sidestepped my way down the muddy slope and eventually reached the doors of the basement. Locked. Above me was the deck, attached to the main floor, along with 4 exterior doors leading into the cabin, but it was too high for me to reach, and I wasn't athletic enough to climb up there, although I was sure someone in better shape could probably do it with ease. I continued around the house, looking for any points of possible entry, but found none. Then I remembered the retaining wall near the main entrance. Maybe I could climb the woodpile, lift myself up onto the retaining wall, and get in through a third-story window. It was worth a try, I thought. I returned to the front of the house, where I discovered that Emily was still waiting for someone to answer the phone. I informed her of my plan, and then I started to climb the woodpile. So far, so good. I reached my hands up to the concrete ledge of the retaining wall, jumped as high as I could, and strained my muscles. God, I'm fat, I thought, but I eventually got up without too much of an issue. Looking around, I noticed several windows accessible from the roof, and, to my surprise, one of them was slightly ajar. "Emily," I yelled, "this one's open." She smiled and yelled back, "Be careful." At this point, I couldn't hold my bladder any longer, and I wasn't about to try and squeeze through a tiny window until I had relieved myself. So I found a little patch of dirt to my left and did my business. It was at this exact moment that I looked down over the retaining wall and noticed something strange. The axe, which had previously been embedded in the center of the stump near the woodpile, was now mysteriously missing. Am I going crazy? I thought to myself. I dismissed it as my imagination and made my way over to the tiny window. The roof was steep and wet, so I once again sidestepped to reduce the risk of slipping. I reached my hand through the small opening in the window and felt around for a handle, but the screen was in the way. I forcefully punched the screen out, and it crashed loudly on the floor inside. I then reached my arm in as far as I could manage and grabbed a hold of the plastic handle, strenuously rotating it counterclockwise until the window was open wide enough for me to crawl through. I slid my left leg in first, straddling the window frame. I popped my head through the curtains and realized that I was in the upstairs bathroom. Awkwardly, I planted my left foot on the tile floor below me, while my right foot remained stationary in the window above, putting me in a weird standing splits position. Good thing I wore sweats, I thought. Finally, after much exertion, I was in. I quickly ran downstairs and opened the front door to let Emily in. Believe it or not, she was still on hold with the rental company for what now had been nearly an hour. At this point, we were both infuriated that this could ever happen. How could our keypad malfunction? It had worked just the day before. And how was I supposed to explain to the rental company that I had to break in and that I damaged a window? Then I suddenly had an uncomfortable thought. Why was the upstairs window open anyway? Were there other windows and doors that weren't secure in the cabin? I ran back upstairs and checked everything. And to my dismay, I found each and every window completely unlocked, and some of them were even wide open. I ran back down to the main floor and checked the windows there. Same thing. Finally, I checked the 4 exterior doors leading out to the back deck. Each one of those was unlocked as well, but they all had deadbolts. When I tried turning the deadbolts to the locked position, they wouldn't budge. Apparently, a key was required to lock them. A key that we didn't have. It's difficult to describe the level of anger I was feeling at this point. Not only had our rental company locked us out of our cabin with all of our belongings still inside, but they had also kept us on hold now for over an hour and allowed us to pay for a cabin that was literally impossible to make secure. Like I said before, someone could easily climb up onto the deck and enter the house, and there was absolutely nothing that we would be able to do about it. As Emily and I sat and discussed our growing level of concern about staying another night, I remembered that I hadn't yet checked the basement windows or doors. Emily stayed in the dining room as I ventured downstairs, and for some unknown reason, the downstairs lights weren't working at the time, so I was forced to use a flashlight as I descended into the unfamiliar dark void. I reached the bottom of the staircase and rounded the corner to discover a large room with 2 sets of bunk beds. From the looks of it, this was meant to be a child's playroom. There were video games in the corner, a short round table to my immediate left, and colorful wallpaper all around the room. From the dim glow of my flashlight, I could see that the windows in this room weren't able to open at all, which gave me the only sense of comfort that I had felt all day. I traversed the eerie, dark room, stepping over creepy dolls and toy trains. I reached the other end of the room and illuminated the exterior doors. Locked, as expected. These were, after all, the doors which I had unsuccessfully attempted to access earlier from the outside. Just as I was about to turn around and head back upstairs, I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. There, standing about 100 feet away from me, outside in the rain, was the man we had seen earlier. He was standing under the deck of the adjacent cabin with his hood up, just staring at me. As soon as he noticed me looking, he turned around and went back inside. Stupidly, I decided to go confront him without talking to my wife first. It seemed very odd to me that when we had left the cabin earlier, this guy was nowhere to be seen, and that when we came back, he was suddenly here with an unmarked van, asking us where we were staying. Not to mention that we were now mysteriously locked out of our house, the hatchet was missing, and this dude was just staring at me through the basement window. 1,000 thoughts raced through my head at once. I wondered if maybe he had waited for us to head into town so he could break in, but we threw him off guard by coming back early. Or if he was somehow responsible for our keypad malfunction. In any case, I needed to go talk to him. I exited the basement and approached him. "Hey," I said. Apparently, he was now on the phone with someone. He held up his finger and told me to hang on. "I need to talk to you," I persisted. "I'm on the phone right now with my, locksmith," he replied. I paced back and forth, waiting for his phone call to end. And when it finally did, he asked me what I wanted. Rather than accusing him of anything suspicious, I told him that we had been locked out and asked him if he had ever heard about the keypads on these cabins malfunctioning. I mean, he did claim to be a maintenance guy after all, so I figured he might have at least some insight. He then proceeded to tell me that he'd never heard of anything like that happening before, but that he could take a look at our keypad if I'd like. Then, without waiting to hear my response, he quickly started walking toward the front door of our cabin. I ran to catch up with him and cut him off before he could get any closer. "Wait a second, what's your name?" I asked. "Jason," he replied. "And what maintenance company do you work for exactly?" I continued. He looked at me coldly. "I'm responsible for the maintenance of most of the cabins in this area, And I used to do maintenance on yours, actually. What is the name of your company? I repeated. He paused for a moment, as if to consider his answer. Cascade Valley, he replied. My wife suddenly opened the front door and introduced herself. Hi, I'm Emily. Hello, Emily, he replied in a low voice. Are you two staying here alone? He asked, staring at Emily. Without thinking, Emily replied, Yeah, we are. I shot her a heated glare, and she immediately realized the significance of her statement. Great, I thought. Now he knew that we were completely alone. You two should be careful. There are groups of people out here called raiders. They track these cabins online and look for vacancies so that they can break in when nobody's home. My wife and I looked at each other, probably sharing this same thought. If the code to our cabin wasn't working, was our cabin now listed as vacant online? The implications of this were enough to make us both shudder, but not as much as the next part of our conversation. Jason proceeded to tell us that because of his history of performing maintenance on our cabin, he knew that the back doors didn't lock, as well as some of the other security issues around the house. As he spoke, he inched closer and closer to the front door. He kept looking past us, as if he was trying to see what we had inside. He even mentioned how he had to break in numerous times in the past for various reasons, and that he knew where the spare key used to be kept. All the while, he continued to fiddle with the metal object in his hands, which I could now tell was a butterfly knife. Now I know what you're thinking. Maybe he was just being helpful. And I would agree with you if it wasn't for a few facts. 1. The axe was still missing. 2. His van was not marked with his apparent company logo. And 3. It seemed like he was going out of his way to try and make us feel safe. Like he wanted us to not leave for some reason. He kept saying things like, "Don't worry, no one will come here tonight. You guys have nothing to be afraid of. I really didn't mean to scare you." As he was talking, I attempted to look up the name of his maintenance company and came up with literally nothing. I even tried different variations of the search, but nothing popped up. He continued to encroach on our space while flicking the knife back and forth. Then I pulled out my phone, snapped a quick picture of him when he wasn't looking, and told him that we had to go back inside now. Emily and I whipped around and walked back into the cabin, closing the front door behind us. By the way, we were still on hold with our rental company at this point. Great service, right? In a bit of a panic, we tried to determine whether we should stay another night or if we should just pack up our things and get the hell out of there. We decided on the latter, because whether or not Jason was just being helpful, we didn't feel comfortable with how much he knew about the security of our cabin, as well as the fact that we were still unable to lock some of the exterior doors. Also, we had nothing to defend ourselves with if someone did get in, whether it happened right now or while we were sleeping later that night. No gun, no knife, nothing. Not to mention, according to the phone call I had overheard earlier, Jason's locksmith friend was supposed to show up at any minute, which meant that things might soon be getting a lot worse for us if Jason wasn't who he claimed to be. This honeymoon was beginning to feel like a nightmare. As we rushed to pack our things, I kept my eyes glued to the windows and my ears perked for any signs of Jason or his friend. We threw everything into our bags haphazardly, leaving some of our food in the kitchen. I was just getting ready to throw my duffel bag over my shoulder when I noticed that my wife had stopped packing. I looked over at her. She was standing still in the middle of the living room, completely frozen, staring blankly at the display on her camera. Thinking about it now, it's almost impossible to accurately depict the look that she wore on her face in that moment. The best way I could describe it would be a mix between horror, disgust, and pure shock. Honey? She stammered. I crossed over to her and looked at what she was pointing at on the screen. It was one of the pictures we had taken out on the deck yesterday. What is it? I asked. She simply pointed to the corner of the screen, and my heart sank into the floor. There, in the corner of the frame, I could see the reflection of a man dressed in all gray clothing. But the reflection wasn't coming from the exterior windows on the deck. Instead, the man was visible in the reflection of the glass on the interior French doors that connected the dining room and the hot tub area, which meant that he wasn't standing outside of the house. He was standing inside. My breathing became erratic as I desperately fumbled for the zoom button. I clicked it a few times and zoomed in on the figure, and there he was. It was Jason, standing in the middle of our dining room while we took pictures on the deck. Horrible thoughts raced through my head, and my wife started to cry. We needed to get out of this house right now. Just then, we heard a vehicle pull up outside. We both ran to the window. It was another unmarked white van. A huge bearded man wearing a denim jacket and black pants stepped out and looked around. We quickly ducked so we wouldn't be seen. After a few short moments, we lifted our heads again and peered out the window. This time, Jason was standing there as well, and it looked like there was something in his hand. I squinted harder, and what I saw made my jaw drop. Jason was holding the axe from the woodpile. Emily and I jumped up, sprinted to the living room, gathered all of our things, and opened the front door, fueled by nothing more than fear and adrenaline. At this point, we figured that Jason was unaware of how much we knew, including the picture. Hopefully, we thought, the two men would head inside before coming over here, giving us a chance to make a run for the car. Luckily, that's exactly what happened next. We watched both men make their way down into the basement of the adjacent cabin. We wasted no time. Emily and I sprinted over to the car and thankfully made it without being noticed. She tugged at the passenger side door handle while repeatedly glancing over her shoulder. "Hurry up," she whispered to me loudly. But just like in any stereotypical scary movie, I was having trouble unlocking the door. The key fob needed new batteries, so I was forced to unlock the door manually. After fumbling around with the keys for what seemed like an eternity, I finally got the door open and tossed everything inside. Just as we slammed the doors shut, we saw Jason and the other man emerge from the cabin. They started walking toward us. Then, when we started the engine, they began running at us in a full-on sprint. I floored it in reverse, sharply cranking the wheel to the left. Then I threw it in drive and smashed the pedal down hard. As we zoomed away from the cabin, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw something that still haunts me to this day. Jason was standing there in the middle of the road, waving goodbye to us in the creepiest way. As he slowly walked in our direction, the axe dragged behind him, and he gave us a menacing smile. Then, he and the other man slowly turned around and went back into our cabin. Emily and I grabbed each other's hands and just breathed. We made it. The drive home was long and mostly quiet as we tried to process what had just happened to us. All told, we were on hold with the rental company for just over 4 hours before the call finally dropped. They never did answer. When we arrived home, we immediately fell asleep, exhausted from everything that transpired. The next morning, we finally got a hold of the rental company. I explained everything about our experience to the regional manager and demanded a full refund for the second night since we weren't able to stay. He agreed, but asked if I could send him the picture of Jason that I had taken. I sent him the picture via email and waited for him to call back. After a few hours, the phone rang. "Hey, it's me again. So I just spoke with the head of our maintenance department for all of the vacation cabins in that area. He said that they checked their system and they couldn't find a single worker with the name Jason. He doesn't seem to exist." My heart started beating out of my chest. He continued, "Also, you know that picture you emailed me? I sent it to everyone in our office, and no one seems to recognize this guy." My body went numb as I sunk deeper into the couch. I thanked him for his time and hung up. To this day, I don't know what Jason wanted from us, or if that was even his real name. There are still so many unanswered questions. Why was he sneaking around our cabin while we were home? What did he want from us? Was he just trying to freak us out? Was he somehow the one that changed our code so we couldn't get back in? Or worst of all, was he some kind of murderous psychopath that was looking for an innocent honeymooning couple to chop up with an axe? And what about the girl next door? Did she check out right after we arrived? Did she drive into town? Or was she the unfortunate victim of an axe-wielding maniac and his friend, disguised as maintenance workers? My wife and I can't be sure, but we know one thing. We will never, ever go back there again. First off, I do not truly believe in anything paranormal. With that being said, I am a general contractor. About 1 year ago, I was doing some work for a customer, which involved remodeling a bathroom. The entire time me and my employee worked in the bathroom, we had a clear shot down the stairs, as it was a second-story bathroom. And both of us kept seeing a black figure poke its head around the corner of the stairs from the living room downstairs. Both of us assumed it was the customer. Then, when the customer came home later, we realized nobody was there besides the two of us while we saw this figure. Eventually, we brought this up to said customer, and she informed us at night she hears loud thuds and also sees black figures peering around corners. This was no concern, and we all just joked about this until we finished the job. There was a mirror we replaced upstairs and took the old one with us. I stored it in my basement for about 3 months until another customer needed a new mirror, so we sold it to her, installed it, and then left. While the mirror was stored in my basement, my wife complained about strange feelings and seeing someone out of the corner of her eye in the basement while doing laundry. And we both heard thuds from the basement on some nights. This all stopped when the mirror was removed. Fast forward 1 month, and I get a call from the customer I sold the mirror to, asking for a new mirror she bought to be hung, and if we could dispose of the one that I had sold her. This took me by surprise, since we had just installed it. I didn't ask, but she told me she had a bad feeling about the mirror and would prefer the new one. She didn't want her money back and paid us to install the new one. Now, the mirror is at my shop, and my employees are saying weird sounds and shadows have been giving them the creeps. The only thing I can think of is the mirror is always at the center of these strange occurrences. Like I said, I don't believe in the paranormal, but I am open-minded. Anybody know what could be happening? I am at a loss. Back in the 80s, my Aunt Kay was in her early 20s. This was before she married my uncle, and when she would drive long distances back and forth between her parents and my uncle's to visit. It was a transitional period for them. He had just graduated, and she hadn't moved out yet to be with him. It was a long drive across several states, through the desert, which took her hours. This desolate highway would have stretches of road that lasted hundreds of miles, where you quite often wouldn't see another driver, let alone a gas station. So Aunt Kay set out and began one of these journeys. A couple hours into the drive, Aunt Kay noticed a dark vehicle slowly catching up to her. She barely noticed as she continued to sing along to Les Miserables until the vehicle got aggressively close. She turned off the music and looked into her rearview mirror, seeing the vehicle flash its brights and a hand pointing at her car and motioning to pull over. Alarmed, she quickly slowed and began to look for a good place to pull off the road to see what must be wrong with her car. The second she began to pull off the road, she said she felt and heard as clear as day, "Don't pull over." Then again, stronger, "Don't pull over." Call it God, intuition, or just a gut feeling, but a jolt of adrenaline and fear shot through Aunt Kay's body as she hit the gas and peeled back out onto the highway. Heart pumping, Aunt Kay silently asked herself, what the hell was that? As she saw the vehicle peel out behind her. The dark vehicle continued to closely follow, flash their brights, and motion to her to pull over. Fear and confusion set in as Aunt Kay began to question what was going on. Why was the driver motioning for her to pull over? Was there something wrong with her car? And what the hell was that warning she felt? It would have been a severe situation if her car broke down out there, especially before cell phones, but she pressed on. Just as her resolve wavered, she started questioning if she truly did feel what she felt. She started slowing back down when the dark vehicle picked up speed. It entered into the oncoming traffic lane and came level to my aunt's car. The driver smiled, pointed, motioned, and mouthed the words, "Pull over," to my aunt. She said the second she looked into his eyes, she felt pure evil. She felt a horribly sick feeling in the pit of her stomach, and again heard the words in her head, "Don't pull over." She described him as looking scary, greasy, and noticed he was missing a couple teeth in his smile that she'll never forget. That sent chills through her. This quickly dispelled any thoughts she had of pulling over, and she put the pedal to the metal to try to lose him. He chased after her, She slowed down, he slowed down. She sped up, he sped up. It got to the point that he began to try to push her car off the road. Aunt Kay was to the point of tears as this creep continued to terrorize her alone, out in the middle of nowhere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Aunt Kay sees a couple of semis off in the distance. She felt if only she could get close, or even get in between those trucks, she would be safe. So she took off. He continued to flash his lights, honk his horn, and try to hit her car until she got close enough to the trucks. As she got in between them, she saw the dark vehicle slow way down and eventually disappear from view. She stayed with the trucks for a couple of hours until she felt safe enough to pull over at a gas station and cry. Fast forward several years. My aunt and uncle are married. He's working at a law firm as a high-profile criminal prosecutor in Las Vegas. She's now a full-time mom of several young children. Since I've known my aunt, she's been obsessed with true crime. Dateline, 2020, and Unsolved Mysteries were always playing at their house. This day was no different. She was folding laundry in the kitchen while listening to the TV in the other room. The interviewer was talking about a man who was being interviewed on death row. As she paired another match of socks, she heard the man describe one of his tactics for procuring victims. According to him, he would wait along the side of the highway. A car would go by with a family, and he'd wait. Another car with a male driver would go by, and he'd wait. But every so often, a car would go by with a pretty woman driving alone. So I'd pull out behind and follow him. I'd flash my brights, honk, and motion for him to pull over. Aunt Kay, paralyzed, continued to listen. When they would eventually pull over, I'd tell them to pop the hood, and I'd be able to tell them what was wrong with their car. They would, and I'd yank a couple wires. When the car wouldn't start, I'd tell them, no problems, my buddy has a shop in the next town. I can give you a ride, and he'll give you a fair deal. My aunt slowly moved to the living room. They'd get in, and I'd kill them. Bury them anywhere in the desert. When asked how many times he had done this, he responded, they'll never find all the bodies. I can't even count. And how many got away? 2 or 3. My aunt stood alone, staring into the same toothless grin she saw on the highway that day. It was Henry Lee Lucas. So about 30 years ago, my ex-boyfriend and I were living in a cottage behind our landlord's house. There was a storage room that was connected to our cottage that always gave me the creeps. Anyway, the first time I encountered the footsteps was one night I was at home, and all of a sudden I heard what sounded like boots circling the cottage and stopping as they approached the storage room. The second time I encountered the footsteps was when my ex-boyfriend and I got into a big fight. It was around 12 a.m., and I stormed out of the cottage. The area we lived in, Manoa, Hawaii, was a fairly quiet neighborhood, so you could hear a pin drop. Anyway, I was walking down the street to release some steam when I heard the same booted footsteps. I stopped, thinking someone was behind me, but when I turned around, the street was empty. There was a pattern to the footsteps, in that every time I stopped, they stopped, and when I would start walking, they would too. This continued for a couple more minutes before I said, "Screw this," and ran back to the cottage, where I told my ex-boyfriend about my encounter. After that, I never heard the phantom footsteps again. This was quite a few years ago, and I've still never got an explanation. My dad and I were driving through East Texas from his house to my mom's, and we were right outside this city, and it was a mixture of farmland and forest, when he noticed something in the air to the left. I looked and saw what can only be described as a white, cloth-like figure in the shape of a woman flying through the air very high above the car. It somewhat resembled the ghosts at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark in just how cloth-like it looked, but it left no trail and seemed to fly independently. It flew from over the left side of the car to the right, and then just vanished while still in the sky. I don't know if it helps, but on this same route a few years ago, we somehow finished the hour-and-a-half drive in just around 20 to 30 minutes. I just have no explanation. I am a 27-year-old woman, and this happened to me 9 or 10 years ago when I was a senior in high school. We lived in a pretty large house, but my siblings were all away at college or boarding school, so it was only my parents and I in the house. I am a crazy light sleeper, so when I woke up in the dark and saw my alarm clock flashing 3:11 a.m., I wasn't too surprised. However, I was wide awake, not just groggily stirring in my sleep. I lay there, wondering what had woken me, when I heard very soft footsteps on the stairs outside my bedroom. The door to my room was parallel to the left side of the bed, and I happened to be laying with my back to the door. When the footsteps approached my door, I thought it must be one of my parents, checking on me for some reason. Then the doorknob was turned so slowly. Still, I thought they were just trying not to wake me. The door began to open again, slowly and carefully. It made a creaking noise no matter how slowly it was opened, so the person finally just shoved it the rest of the way to silence the creak. Still, my naive brain thought it was one of my parents, until they clicked on a flashlight. I froze. Terror flooded me, and I remember that I instantly broke out in sweat. They were behind me, and I was facing away, so they couldn't see my eyes wide open as they shone the beam straight on me. I always used to think that if something like that ever happened, I would be such a badass, and I would whip out of bed and punch them, attack them, shout, scream, do something. But I could do nothing at all. All I could do was try to keep my breathing deep and even, despite the pounding of my heart, so that the intruder wouldn't know I was awake. After about 10 seconds, they finally moved the light away. I prayed and begged and bartered with anything that would listen to me as the intruder walked around my room, looking at my things. I could vaguely see their shape, large and bulky, like they were wearing 2 coats. They didn't shine the flashlight on me again, and after a few minutes, which felt like an eternity, they left my room. I could still hear them, though, walking around the rest of the 2nd floor, through my siblings' empty bedrooms. I was still sweating, still frozen in terror, not knowing what to do. I wanted to grab my phone and call my dad, sleeping downstairs. I wanted to call our landline so that the phone would ring and wake my parents up. I wanted to call the police. I wanted to get up and run from my room. I wanted to cry. But I couldn't do any of those things. I was afraid that they would hear me, and I didn't know if they had a weapon and would try to hurt me or my parents. I wouldn't wish such helpless terror on my worst enemy. I don't know how, but I must have passed out from fear, or the adrenaline wore off and I fell asleep somehow, because the next thing I knew, it was 6 a.m., and I could hear my parents downstairs. I ran downstairs, and as calmly as I could, I asked them if one of them had been in my room last night. Their faces went blank, and they said no, they hadn't. That was the last straw. I broke down in sobs and told them, then someone was in my room last night. Even as I type this, my hands have begun shaking, and I've teared up. The police were called, even though there was little they could do at that point. Apparently, when my parents woke up, all of the doors to the outside were standing wide open, and there was a duffel bag at the bottom of the stairs. All that was inside was a coil of nylon rope and an empty USB flash drive. I don't want to think about what it was for. The intruder hadn't taken anything, and we have no idea why they left in what appeared to be a hurry. It took me about a week to be able to sleep in my own room, a sanctuary which felt violated and frightening to me now. I carry pepper spray, sleep with a machete next to my bed, and double-check my locks every night. Hopefully, this will never happen again. But if it does, hopefully I won't freeze. It's been 10 years, and my most common nightmare is that someone is in my room, standing in the shadows, watching me.